Never did the music ever let me down.
He opened a giant door, and all these other musicians came flowing through.
He got a lot of love, and the more he got, the harder it was for him to accept it.
Well, heroin was always the great dark force that you weren't supposed to get near, and yet there it was, Jerry Garcia in its grip.
It was just amazing that he stayed alive as long as he did, doing what he was doing.
Jerry Garcia is next on Biography.
Nothing to lose.
Leads you to where you are today.
I believe in storytelling.
Gonna make you a star.
I'm still trying to figure that out.
And it's a sad day, as you know by now. Jerry Garcia has died in San Francisco.
His fans gathered across the nation to express their grief. Not with tears, but with raucous celebration.
We all loved him, and we all loved his music. We all just wanted to come out here and show him a little respect.
In a display typical of a Grateful Dead concert, they came to pay tribute to their hero, one of the great improvisational guitarists of all time. The legendary Jerry Garcia was dead at 53.
Just a big loss for the world, for anyone who loves music.
I feel like Peter Pan died. That part of me that will always be a kid is dead.
He'll just go on and on forever. He's not dead.
To his followers, Jerry Garcia was more than a rock star. He was practically a deity.
There was some kind of holy power to his charisma that radiated pretty large. I mean, he was in some ways a godlike being.
He had that ability to take you to a higher place, whether it was in the music or whether you were sitting down having a conversation with him.
Garcia burst onto the San Francisco music scene just as the turbulent 60s were beginning to crank up.
We know what we're trying to do. We're trying to grow up.
He quickly became a symbol of the free-living, experimental lifestyle and all that it embodied: sex, drugs, and rock and roll, especially drugs.
Do you think that your idea, the hip idea, is essentially connected up with drugs?
Yeah, I would say that's a large part of the framework. I think that most of the people who are hippies now came to it through drugs.
Jerry said that psychedelics were the most important thing that ever happened to him in his life. They presented a world of possibilities that he hadn't even imagined.
Passing out the diplomas is Ken Kesey.
Garcia discovered LSD when he crossed paths with Ken Kesey, author of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Kesey, who had been a volunteer in the government's testing of LSD, became an outspoken advocate of the mind-expanding drug. Years later, Kesey and Garcia spoke about those early days when LSD was legal.
There was tremendous curiosity about psychedelics, and there were a lot of people who were just really curious and interested in finding out what it was about and what it was like, you know. It was a matter of...
It was like the space shuttle.
Yeah, it was something to try. Yeah, that's exactly right. He's right. It was a technological improvement, you know, something new.
Anything experimental like that, he was going to go for it because he wanted not to miss anything. He didn't want to miss anything, and he didn't.
But he paid a heavy price. Garcia's creative journey led him on a roller coaster ride to great heights and desperate lows. From fame and fortune to drug addiction and ill health. A ride not unlike the lonesome heroes in many of his famous songs.
Just might get some sleep tonight.
He was definitely a lonely prophet out on his own frontier. And he certainly understood what it was to be an outcast. He never felt like he was an incast.
You know, I'll tell you, we fit into the 60s about as poorly as we fit into now, you know. I mean, you know, really, frankly. We were there. We were always about 90 degrees out of whack from everything else, no matter what it was.
Garcia's free-flowing lifestyle didn't have a lot of room for family life. He left behind a trail of broken marriages and 4 daughters who barely saw him.
He had many virtues, but he wasn't the world's greatest father.
This is a guy who's on the road 9 months out of the year, you know, and when, you know, as soon as he comes off the road, you know, he's exhausted and, you know, beat down. Whenever he was around, he, you know, was a great You know, was a great dad and lots of fun and tons of love and everything. I didn't hold anything against him.
Music was his great love. It's not that everybody else came second, but the music seemed to come first.
But to family, friends, and fans, Jerry Garcia's virtues always far outweighed his flaws.
He always would put himself in the position of being the giver, and he gave every time. I never saw him cut somebody off or shoo them away.
When I was working on my biography of Garcia, I was amazed at how many people said the exact same things, which are, he was the smartest person I ever knew, and he lit up a room like nobody I'd ever met before.
This man put out so much love and radiated it, and then years later, something he would tell me, I would dawn on me and say, my God, what a smart, caring person he was.
Despite his huge success, Garcia never lost an almost childlike vulnerability.
It always struck me as amazing and marvelous that he was as insecure as he was, because he was. He never went on stage without feeling stage fright.
He identified with the Cowardly Lion in The Wizard of Oz, very much, his personality, okay? He was like that. Born Leo, August 1st, he was a lion sign. But sometimes his courage about himself deserted him.
To the outside world, Garcia was a master at hiding his insecurities, but behind that lovable smile, there was a dark force pulling him ever deeper into the black hole of addiction.
He tried many times to get himself in a place away from a dependency, but, that sweet tooth, that sweet tooth.
So on August 9th, 1995, his followers came together around the country, not to mourn his weaknesses, but to celebrate his greatness, his music.
I lit out from Reno, I was trailed by 20 hounds.
So if you listen to a song like, you know, Friend of the Devil, that's a traditional song, written in a slightly new way. And the sentiment of that song is like American to its core.
Friend of the devil is a friend of mine.
He wasn't just a rock player. He loved all kinds of music and incorporated that into everything that he did.
He opened a giant door, and all these other musicians came flowing through.
An incredible legacy for a poor boy who taught himself how to play the guitar.
I think you're born with the soul you got. My guess is that Garcia was born Garcia.
A perfect straight white smile is a phone call away. Discover Lumineers.
And on A&E. By the time Jerry Garcia died, he had performed in nearly 4,000 shows, made over 20 albums, earned hundreds of millions of dollars, and left a musical legacy that many believe will endure for generations to come.
The Grateful Dead were one of the most incredible and most influential American bands in history.
It was a mighty accomplishment for a little boy who started out life with some powerful strikes against him.
He was basically unsupervised for most of his childhood.
Jerry's mother, Ruth, a nurse and pianist, fell in love with a young musician named Joe Garcia. They married in 1935 and had 2 sons. The second one, Jerome John Garcia, named after the great Broadway composer Jerome Kern, arrived in August 1942. But his childhood years were filled with trouble. At 4, his older brother Tiff accidentally chopped Jerry's finger with an axe while cutting wood.
I hacked it, but I didn't take it off. I just wounded it enough where they couldn't get the surgery in time. And so they amputated it. He never even mentioned it to me.
He said it ended up being good as a guitarist because even though he had one finger less to do, say, finger picking, it was a place where you could sort of store a pick.
But there was no silver lining to the next life-altering event only a year later. The Garcias were in Northern California on a fishing vacation when tragedy struck.
Joe was fishing one afternoon and he slipped on a rock and was swept under and pinned under a rock and he drowned.
watched his father drown, watched him drown.
He said that his father's death was something that really wasn't talked about that much. It was, he said he felt excluded from it.
In her grief, Jerry's mother basically shut down. The two boys were sent to live across the street with their grandparents.
We barely got any supervision there. My grandfather just wanted to make sure we had food and we were inside. Once we were out of the house, he didn't care where we went or for how long.
From a very early age, it was clear that Jerry Garcia was not going to be the conventional good student in school, taking the straight and narrow path into the business world and all that kind of stuff. He always had interests that were outside of the mainstream. I mean, he liked, EC comics, which were those gruesome comics, and he was a big reader, a voracious reader.
But 1957 brought new passions, pot and music. For his 15th birthday, his mother gave him his first musical instrument, a used accordion. He promptly pawned it for a guitar and spent hours a day teaching himself to play.
Kind of introverted, he was into his music and, drawing, and he didn't need to go out and play or ride around and cruise and stuff.
Then, in 1960, the aspiring musician stunned everyone. He dropped out of high school and signed on with Uncle Sam.
He was a poor kid who was looking for something to do, and I think he probably had a suspicion that, that the Army was going to take a good look at him and spit him out, which it did.
This is a person who had pretty much done whatever he wanted for most of his life and had been largely unsupervised for most of his youth. So to suddenly have a guy, have some drill guy telling him what to do, it was not a good fit.
9 months and 8 AWOLs later, the drill sergeant and the future rock star had a meeting of the minds.
The Army said, this is really not working out for us. Would you like to be out of the Army? And Jerry said, yes, I would like that very much.
By then, the beat scene had transformed Northern California into a social experiment, and the 18-year-old Jerry Garcia wanted to be a part of it. So Garcia headed 33 miles south of San Francisco to Palo Alto, home to Stanford University and a hopping bohemian subculture.
He basically starts living hand to mouth, crashing on friends' floors and staying wherever he can for a day or two at a time, and eventually even ending up living in a car, an abandoned car.
A master at guitar and banjo by this time, Garcia started experimenting with a variety of different kinds of bands.
Garcia could play pretty much any American genre really well. I mean, and at that point, the cool thing to do was bluegrass. And so they tried that at first.
It was during these years that Garcia connected with many of the musicians and writers who would later make up the Grateful Dead: Robert Hunter, Bob Weir, Phil Lesh, Bill Kreutzmann, and Ron McKernan, affectionately known as Pigpen.
Interestingly enough, for a long time, Pigpen was the canonical Grateful Dead focal point. I mean, if you thought about the Grateful Dead, what you thought about was Pigpen, because he was out in front and he was the most curious of the lot. It was music to irritate your parents. And there was something about the sight of Pigpen that would irritate anybody's parents,
They made their debut as the Warlocks in early 1965 and created quite a sensation.
The word had gotten out that there was something interesting going on with these crazies, and so it was quite a big scene.
When Garcia wasn't making music, he was hanging out at Kepler's bookstore, a haunt for free-thinking intellectual types, one of whom he would fall in love with and eventually marry, Sarah Rubenthal, a 19-year-old sophomore at Stanford.
It is love and lust at first sight. She gets pregnant immediately. He said, let's get married. Sarah's parents were horrified that she wanted to marry Jerry. They said, we'll send you around the world, anything, just don't do this. Please don't marry this guy.
Despite their desperate pleas, the couple married and had a daughter named Heather.
They were fine for a couple of years until rock and roll broke it all to pieces.
That rock and roll explosion erupted in 1964 when 4 shaggy-haired kids from Liverpool invaded the hearts and minds of a generation and changed musical history. Jerry Garcia and his band, the Warlocks, were as blown away by the Beatles' look and sound as the rest of the world. Not wanting to miss out on the rock and roll revolution, the Warlocks reinvented themselves and changed both their sound and their name.
Jerry opened up a Funk and Wagnalls dictionary and opened up to the term Grateful Dead, which is a folk tale dealing with a guy who dies impoverished, and a guy comes along and helps pay his debts, and then he is somehow, through that great act, has good fortune come to him.
Their good fortune came pouring in. The Grateful Dead soon found themselves front and center in San Francisco's burgeoning hippie movement, a movement fueled by peace, love, and for Jerry Garcia, mind-expanding drugs.
Some of that high-powered rocket fuel? Well, let me take a sip.
Oh, I think LSD was probably the single biggest thing that ever happened to him.
We got a kid who's killing himself for $20 a hit.
He's in trouble.
At the Home Depot. Good, better, Bear.
By the mid-1960s, LSD was fueling a psychedelic revolution, and Jerry Garcia was under its mind-altering spell.
LSD presented a world of possibilities that he hadn't even imagined. Psychedelics affected music, affected sort of every part of your being. It revealed things to him that were profound.
The Grateful Dead became the house band for Ken Kesey's notorious tripping parties, wild free-for-alls called the acid test.
The nice thing about the acid test was that we could play or not in the acid test, and a lot of times we would get we'd be too high really to play. And we'd play for maybe a minute. That's what we call it. And then we lose it, you know?
Their days at the acid tests, Garcia later said, established the basic pattern that would define the Grateful Dead: pure counterculture and freedom of expression, a philosophy they practiced at their new home in Haight-Ashbury.
Jerry was the center of a very busy house. It becomes practically a commune because it's most of the Dead, and girlfriends and hangers-on and, you know, whoever's there.
It seems the only people Jerry Garcia wasn't living with were his wife and daughter.
Jerry and Sarah had split up essentially, and Jerry was sowing his own wild oats in many different ways. So they kind of drifted apart during that period.
Garcia set his sights on Carolyn Adams, a wild, outspoken girl from Poughkeepsie, New York. In true hippie fashion, she was known as Mountain Girl. But don't let the name fool you. She had an edge.
He and Mountain Girl had this relationship that was just, you know, it was scary to be around them because they'd dress you up and take you apart and dress you back down again, and you wouldn't even know what had happened until, you know, a few minutes later. It wasn't like they were being mean about it. It was just they were having a good time with other people's foibles.
Mountain Girl was a constant in his life that never faltered. I think she was always there.
They would have 2 daughters and be together on and off for the next 25 years. But it would be a bumpy ride, mostly because he could never fully commit. Though not classically handsome, he was irresistible to women.
Errol Flynn, he wasn't. You know, he was attractive to women because of the same reason he was attractive to a lot of people, because he had this huge force in him, this presence that was bigger than the Rock of Gibraltar.
He was a magnet. You know, how can you not be attracted to a magnet? You know, it just happens. And he was a very strong presence. He was a very strong man, very strong presence. And that attracts.
In the summer of 1967, Jerry Garcia's appeal was about to be tested on a grand scale. The band was asked to perform at the country's first huge outdoor rock concert, the Monterey Pop Festival. It was a chance to expand their popularity beyond the San Francisco scene, but the Dead got lost in the crowd.
Well, that was one of our classic bad scenes.
we came on the stage just after The Who finished smashing their equipment for the first time in America, you know what I mean? This was, the audience was devastated, you know. The Who were beautifully theatrical and stuff, and there's clouds of smoke and explosions, and they're clearing away the debris, you know. So we come out and play our little set, you know, ding, 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 and then Jimi Hendrix comes on after us and annihilates any remnant of any, you know, I mean, if anybody noticed this, that was it, you know, it was erased from existence, and I was like, oh, come on, you know. That was where we were on the show, and it didn't pan out for us.
Jerry was hopeful that their next outdoor concert would be much more successful, but that didn't go well either. Unfortunately, it was the biggest concert event of the era, Woodstock.
We tried to play there, yeah.
It wasn't really
call
it wasn't really playing.
No. We escaped electrocution. That's what we did.
It started to rain. The stage was falling. Half of the PA went out. AM, FM radios were coming in.
There were bolts of lightning hitting the stage and bouncing onto our guitars.
String, get a shot.
It was amazing.
And all of a sudden, we did what we normally do in those kind of situations. Failed miserably.
Despite their misfortunes at Monterey and Woodstock, the Grateful Dead were still well on their way. By the 1970s, their popularity was soaring, and no one was more surprised than Jerry Garcia himself.
The first time that there were more people in the audience than there were on stage was the biggest surprise of all, and everything since then has been kind of more of that same thing of, God, they like it.
Not only did they like it, they built their lives around it. A new breed of fans so devoted, so obsessed, they earned their own name, the Deadheads.
They have developed their own society.
Absolutely. They were self-invented, you know, and they invented us right along with themselves.
Jerry's kids.
Jerry, his philosophy was that when he plays it, it goes to that audience, and they took it. They absorbed it and gave us back all the love you could ever ask for.
When I walked in here to the theater tonight, I came home. This is home for me, and I'm 3,000 miles from home.
Wherever the Grateful Dead went, the Deadheads followed. A movable feast of all ages, all walks of life.
This is what Deadheads are.
Usually sporting tie-dyed t-shirts and smoking a joint.
The Grateful Dead offered a safe place for multitudes to congregate around something that was alive to them.
Every time I come here, I feel like a part of me just comes out and blossoms.
It became a thing where the Deadhead world outside of the band became self-sustaining in a way. The getting there, the being there, the meeting people all became almost as important as the music to a lot of people.
The Deadheads came for the scene and the music, but there was never any doubt who was at the center of this universe.
Garcia was always the focal point on that stage. You know, it was Jerry, Jerry, Jerry all the time, because he was who he was without trying to be anything. He was so powerful without trying to be powerful.
It seems to me that over the past century, vacuum cleaners have had such an obvious design flaw. It's a wonder we've all put up with it. Because they have 4 fixed wheels, the only move they can easily perform is a straight line. With fixed axles, you can go forwards and backwards.
With his wild hair and burly frame, Jerry Garcia didn't look like a legend in the making, but his star power was overwhelming.
There's only been 2 musicians I've ever seen who had the kind of charisma that Jerry had. One was Jerry, and the other one was Zappa. Those were 2 people that would walk on stage and you knew it. You just could not take your eyes off the guy.
The Hindus have this notion of avatars, you know, sort of manifest beings from the spiritual world that come in and become human. And, you know, he was a good argument for the idea that such things exist.
He moved people, you know. I mean, there would be, I remember a police officer in New York walking up to me and Jerry on the street one day and said, "You Jerry Garcia, aren't you?" And he said, "Yeah." And the cop looked at him and said, I came to your show the night my dad died. It still chokes me up to this day. And he said, thank you so much. That you just took me out of the worst thing that ever happened to me.
While Garcia and the Dead's music was healing to fans, the wild lifestyle of rock and roll was beginning to take its toll behind the scenes. In 1973, Pigpen, the lovable, scruffy singer and keyboard player, died. He basically drank himself to death at age 27. Through the years, others would follow down the same destructive path.
They died of rock and roll. You know, you can call it drugs or alcohol or something, but you got to really understand what that lifestyle does to people or can do to people. And it becomes very tempting to try to manage it by artificial means. And also you got people around you all the time that are saying, you know, have some of this.
But by then, the train was moving so fast, there was no getting off. Between 1970 and 1974, the Dead put out some of their most enduring records: Working Man's Dead, American Beauty, Skull and Roses, Wake of the Flood in Mars Hotel. But making records was not his first love.
A record is like building a ship in a bottle, you know, and a live performance is like being in a rowboat on the open sea.
And the open sea is where Garcia wanted to be. The Grateful Dead never had a top 10 song in the 1970s, but they became one of the most popular touring bands in the country. Their creation, the massive wall of sound, transformed the concert-going experience.
It was revolutionary. It was a wall of sound that played to the audience. The audience heard what the band was hearing.
Audiences from Anchorage, Alaska to the pyramids in Egypt were totally taken in by the Dead's marathon concerts and jazz-like improvisational playing.
You didn't feel like you were getting handed a show. You know what I mean? It was just relaxed.
Sometimes it's just plumb awful, you know. Sometimes it's incredibly great, and no matter which way it goes, you're never in control. And that's the part that makes it really interesting. That's really the, you know, that's you know, you don't know what's going to happen, and you don't know whether it's going to be good or not. And sometimes the shows that subjectively to us that we hate, where, boy, we've never had a worse night, oh, the audiences love them.
The Dead prized their connection with the audience above all else. They were the first major band in rock and roll history to let fans tape their concerts for free.
He didn't exude any ownership over the music. It belonged to the people. And because it belonged to the people, let the people do what they want to with it.
If we're going to start worrying about people taping, then what else are we going to start worrying about?
Yeah, then we're going to have to start worrying about how they behave. I mean, it's like trying to control the world. You know, you're out there pretty soon, and it's, Jesus, this guy doesn't look right to me. What do you think? Okay, no ticket for you, buddy.
Funny around the eyes, you know. At least put him in the...
Right. Put him somewhere he won't hurt nobody.
Right.
While the Grateful Dead's touring schedule was relentless and exhausting, Garcia somehow found the time and energy to put out records and play gigs with side bands. One of them, the Jerry Garcia Band, would become almost as revered as the Grateful Dead.
Each of the rose get caught on the brow. Woman to love, next thing there's a fire.
Jerry just loved to play. I mean, he played every night. He started solo bands. He would play at clubs. He would go down to the studio and help out other people making their own records. And he was a music junkie first.
There are a hell of a lot of musicians, especially in rock and roll, that, you know, for whom going on the road and all the pretty girls and bright lights and stuff is the real deal. Garcia liked to go on the road because that was where you got to play music. And a lot of the time when all the rest of us were taking it apart at the hotel bar, Garcia would be up in his room practicing, being kind of solitary.
Garcia's lust for music left little room for the women in his life.
I think you could safely say that he was a commitment phobe, didn't really like to be tied down.
Garcia is hardly the only person in history that ever sabotaged all of his relationships. If he'd had the slightest inkling of how to accept love, a lot of things would have been different.
Garcia would go from one woman to another throughout his life. In 1975, he left his psychedelic soulmate, Mountain Girl, for budding filmmaker Deborah Coons. His timing was brutal. Mountain Girl recently had their second daughter, Trixie.
You could go on and on like, oh, you know, we weren't a good enough family for him and he, you know, he had to go off and do that. But what you learn is, you know, just about like human nature and people and their weaknesses, and it's okay.
But there was no escaping one of Garcia's other weaknesses. In the early 70s, he began a dangerous dance with cocaine. As his fame skyrocketed and the decade progressed, so did his drug use.
The drug appears to be a relatively harmless, smokable form of opium that was known as Persian. And really what it turns out to be is a type of heroin. And so Jerry and various other people start smoking this, and for a while it didn't really seem to be a problem. Eventually it grabbed a hold of him and he became severely addicted to it.
Drugs are a refuge, and then more and more people coming around, and you just want to hide. That's what hard drugs are. You take heroin, you're gone. You go whoosh, right back into your own head. It's pretty comfortable in there.
Despite his increasing dependency on heroin, Garcia kept up his Herculean schedule and most of the time was able to perform at the top of his game.
He had such a strong will. He just, it was just amazing that he went through what he did and stayed alive as long as he did, doing what he was doing. Very strong-willed, very strong man.
To legions of deadheads, there were no flaws, no weaknesses, only unconditional love and adoration, something Garcia could never understand.
He didn't feel that he was worthy of that much attention. He would say to me many times, he said, there's a million guys that can play guitar like me. Where were they? I don't know. I've never heard another. But he felt that way.
That's a big part of why rock and roll can be fatal, or why fame of any sort can be fatal. You know, you get all this love that you don't know what to do with because you don't think you deserve it. And the more he got, the harder it was for him to accept it.
On an all-new 1-hour Gene Simmons Family Jewel.
Thumbplay has the best tones, games, wallpaper, and video for just $9.99 a month. Standard messaging charges may apply. Get Thumbplay today.
No.
When's the last time you were sleeping?
What year is this?
It was the 80s, a decade of highs and lows that would bring Garcia to the brink of death. It started out on a high note. On New Year's Eve, 1981, Garcia married his longtime on-again, off-again love, Mountain Girl.
Garcia would go back to Mountain Girl because that was, as I say, that was a place where he tended to be all right.
I think Mountain Girl was his stability. It was home. She was home. Someone who could stand with him the way that he stood. She was on equal footing.
I think they had a great time together, and if you see some of the pictures of my parents when they were in their 20s, they're just a beautiful couple.
But the marriage didn't mean Garcia was ready to settle down. Even Mountain Girl's positive influence couldn't stop him from slipping deeper and deeper into the abyss of cocaine and heroin.
It made him more difficult to deal with because at some point the craving for the drug and the drug itself sort of takes over your main interest.
It didn't help that drugs were as plentiful as tie-dye t-shirts at Grateful Dead concerts.
Stage would be littered with stuff, you know, depending upon what the drug of choice was in the fads of the starting through the ages. Everybody brought, what do you want to bring to your gods? If you've ever seen, you know, an altar where people leave offerings, this is what it was like.
Do you feel any kind of a sense of responsibility for the use of drugs by lots of young kids who wanted to emulate their hero, you?
No, I don't. I mean, I don't feel a sense of personal responsibility, mostly because I've avoided, or I've tried to avoid, telling people what to do or not do.
So you're not an advocate?
No.
What you do yourself?
That's exactly right.
For years, Garcia had famously sung the praises of LSD and pot, but his heroin use was well hidden. All that changed in 1985 when he was busted in Golden Gate Park smoking heroin in his car.
It wasn't out that they were looking to get him or anything. He got stupid behind the wheel and stopped, and you know, when you do stupid things, they coming back to haunt you in strange ways.
Not that many people really knew that he was a heroin user, believe it or not. It was pretty shocking to people because heroin was kind of the great no-no, and yet there it was, you know, with Jerry Garcia in its grip.
It wasn't just drugs that were destroying his body. Years of unhealthy living had taken its toll. In 1986, Garcia developed adult-onset diabetes and was in the worst shape of his life.
I don't think it would be possible to take worse care of yourself physically than Jerry Garcia did. You know, he chain smoked unfiltered Camels, pell-mells too. He never got any exercise that I could see. Ate nothing but junk food. It was like, kind of like the anti-health diet.
His weight had ballooned, and he had edema in his legs that made his legs swell, and this kind of ghostly gray-white pallor.
At age 43, Garcia lapsed into a diabetic coma that nearly killed him.
I was notified immediately that, you know, to pray for Jerry, like everybody around the world was doing, was praying for him. We were all, you know, in the battle for his life.
To everyone's amazement, Jerry Garcia pulled through, barely.
When he first woke up, he didn't know how to play the guitar. He didn't know anybody's names.
He said his brain was like file folders had all been thrown onto the floor and been mixed up.
He had to teach himself how to play the guitar again. It was not easy, I don't think. But he definitely came out of there at a full run.
There was a period after he came back from his coma. For the next 2 or 3 years, he was maybe the best he'd been since the early 70s. He was sharp, his playing was great. It was kind of a second golden era for the Grateful Dead.
For Garcia, it was a rebirth. He started doing artwork, colorful paintings and drawings that would later be turned into a lucrative line of neckties. Ben and Jerry's even named an ice cream for him, Cherry Garcia.
Huh? What? Ice cream? You know, I really don't know how to relate to it.
But stranger than ice cream, and even stranger than creating a necktie line for a man who never wore a tie, the Grateful Dead achieved something they had never done before. In 1987, they had their first hit song, appropriately titled A Touch of Grey.
The first single is A Touch Grey. Is it referring to A Touch of Grey?
Well, it sounds like it does, yeah, but in reality, it doesn't really, you know, it's not that specific. It's more of a general, it's kind of a general complaint kind of song. It's a thing, things are going really badly, but that's okay. We're still holding up, you know, that's kind of what it expresses.
While riding the wave, Garcia continued playing and recording music with artists outside the Grateful Dead, notably master mandolinist David Grisman. Their partnership was documented in the film Grateful Dog.
Jerry, he started the Dead style of music. He's a pioneer of that. David, he started dog music.
But while Garcia's musical life was back on track, his home life once again was a train wreck. One day in 1988, Jerry unceremoniously let Mountain Girl and his daughters know that he was leaving.
And there's this woman standing in our driveway. We have a long driveway with the baby. The baby in her arms, standing in our driveway. And none of us were too shocked. I mean, it's just bite the bullet kind of situation.
The woman in the driveway was a 27-year-old deadhead named Menasha Matheson. The baby, of course, was Jerry's new daughter.
I don't know if anyone ever sat me down and was like, well, this is what, you know, and Jerry's been on the road and this lady's, you know, been shacking up with him or whatever. So, yeah, just kind of, you got a thick hide and whatever comes, you just deal with it.
Garcia moved in with Menasha and for a while lived a healthy lifestyle. But around 1990, he slid back into the grip of heroin. This time, the toll his addiction took on the entire band was obvious.
We had not seen the Dead in like 8 years or something. And it was just sad. It was really sad. I was deeply saddened by what had become of the whole thing.
By the summer tour of '91, Garcia was so strung out, some bandmates and crew members staged an intervention at his house.
We walked in one by one. He looked at us and said, oh, okay, they're all here. You know, it was just a tight brothers, the band and crew. We came there, and he went, when the last one came in, he walked out, closed the door, and took off, man.
But later that night, Garcia checked himself into rehab, and for the next 4 years, he would wage a valiant battle to stay alive.
He was trying as hard as he could to straighten himself out, but once he was stripped of all and clean of all drugs, he'd really damaged his health, and it was too far gone for him to regain it.
Whoa.
By 1992, Jerry Garcia was in trouble, physically and mentally. Battling an enlarged heart, diabetes, and heroin addiction, he became a recluse in his own home.
I went over and he was, kind of stewing in his own juices. And finally I said, this is a hard thing to say, but sometimes I wish you'd die so that we could mourn you. And he just gave me this look and got up and padded down the hall and went into his bedroom and put a "Do Not Disturb" sign on his own bedroom door. And it was just so solitary and bleak.
As bleak as those years were, Garcia never lost his ability to charm women. In 1994, he got married for the third time to an old flame, the woman he had left Mountain Girl for in the 1970s, Deborah Coons. But, like others in his life, she was helpless in the face of Garcia's heroin addiction.
There's nothing anyone could do. I mean, people make their own decisions ultimately. You can't make anybody do anything they don't want to. So you just love them and try not to, worry.
In the summer of 1995, Garcia tried to pull himself together for another Grateful Dead tour. It was a disaster.
Most of the shows had moments where people were kind of scratching their heads saying, what's wrong with Jerry?
The charismatic man with the twinkle in his eye now seemed distant on stage. His diabetes, long out of control, caused him to lose feeling in his fingers, dimming the once beautiful sound of his guitar. Nothing on this tour was going right.
People were struck by lightning, and another show, a porch in Missouri collapsed, and people were killed, I think, and it was the tour from hell, people called it.
Gatecrashers wreaked havoc at some of the concerts, and there was even a death threat against Garcia. The stress had a devastating effect.
Jerry was sort of complaining, I feel like a 70-year-old, I feel, my body is failing me.
When he finally returned home, Garcia was exhausted and strung out. In August 1995, he finally checked himself into a treatment center, but it was too late.
And that night, he died. His body was discovered at like 4 in the morning, allegedly with a smile on his face. He'd had a massive heart attack and died.
I expected it for years. I wasn't crushed. I really wasn't. It almost said, it's about time, because you're doing such bad shape and you're still doing the same thing. What are you going to expect?
Even though people talked about it and were afraid that this was going to happen and this and that, when it actually happened, nobody could believe it. It was like, this can't be real. People like that aren't supposed to die.
My mother woke me up at about 6 o'clock in the morning, and she gave me this sharp look, and she said, "I've got news. Your life is about to become very different." Because Garcia was dead. She knew that my life would be very different without him in the world, and it has been.
It was also the end of an era for millions of deadheads who had followed Garcia across the country over the past 30 years.
I got a message from my mother. She was like, well, Jerry's passed, and I'm sorry, but time to cut your hair and come on home.
But a decade later, he is still very much alive in the memories of the many people whose lives he touched.
I still carry his pick because I know if I get run over or fall out of a car and we meet in heaven or hell, he will say to me, "You got a pick?"
I am still gleaning and growing from things that Garcia really taught me in this real unique way.
He is a really wise person. He's a good thinker. Although he wasn't the greatest role model, as far as how to live your life, we learned from the good and the bad.
After Garcia died, the Grateful Dead disbanded. His death left an empty space in the lives of those who knew and loved him, but he left behind a musical legacy to fill the void.
He was a guy who drew on all the paths that make American music great.
I'm amazed still, you know, how great the music is and, you know, how inspired it is.
It turned people that had hate in their heart. I've seen that happen. And violence and anger melted away at the face of this thing. Never did the music ever let me down.
Jerry's life was a turbulent and glorious ride. A combustible mixture of adoration, addiction, and musical genius. A strange trip that brought him immortality. But for Jerry Garcia, it was never about the destination. It was about the fun of getting there.
If there's anybody out there who is not enjoying a long, strange trip, I'm sorry.